welcome to the 44 Original Podcast. I'm your host, Abdallah, and I'm joined today by a special guest, author Ray Hartjen, who wrote Immaculate, How the Steelers Saved Pittsburgh. And that's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the Steelers in the 70s, how they had a tremendous impact on the growth of the city of Pittsburgh, and a couple other topics here and there. But first of all, Ray, how you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks, Khaled, for having me on the show. I know you're a Raiders fan, and it must have been very difficult for you to think about having having an author on who wrote a book about, of all teams, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and maybe what could have been worse for you, maybe the Kansas City Chiefs. But I want you to know that I feel your pain because I did not grow up a Steelers fan, and so I being a Texan. Born in Houston, I was a Dallas Cowboys fan back in the day. The Houston Oilers were my second favorite team, being a good Texan. Both of those teams looked at the Pittsburgh Steelers as kind of gum on their shoes, right? The Cowboys famously lost 2 Super Bowls. The Houston Oilers never could win the AFC Central Division, what was called at the time, and lost 2 playoff games at Pittsburgh. And then my third favorite team was my mama's favorite team. My mama's favorite team was the Oakland Raiders because she liked Kenny Stabler, just like everybody's mama liked Kenny Stabler.
I was going to say,
then the Raiders, geez, they lost 3 playoff games to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Won 2 of them on their way to, one of them on the way to a Super Bowl championship. But as I've shared with you before, the 12-year-old Ray would be pretty disappointed that I wrote a book about the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Yeah, those are some of the great rivalries of the AFL and NFL in the 70s. You said Oilers and Raiders, and of course Raiders Steelers. It's still kind of a rivalry. I would say the games do get pretty testy between the fans. So I think my logical assumption, picking up the book, seeing you on Podmatch, looking at the title and all that, my logical assumption was that you were from Pittsburgh, and that's what made you want to write this book. So now that that's not the case, now that we know that's not the case, what inspired you to write this book, and how did you choose the title?
The book is actually the genesis of the book. The catalyst of the book is from my friend and co-author Tom Olenek. Tom is a Yinzer. That's what I've learned to call natives of Pittsburgh, and he loves his city, and in fact he doesn't love his state. He loves his city. He is not from Pennsylvania. He is from Pittsburgh, right? And for decades, he has gone around with this thesis that, when he was a kid, Pittsburgh had to go through a deindustrialization transformation, and it was painful. And they weren't the only ones that had to do it. All the Rust Belt cousins like Cleveland and Detroit and Akron and Youngstown and Gary, Indiana, all those, Buffalo, all those, cities, struggled in the 70s and 80s. But Pittsburgh came out of it smelling like a rose. Today, Pittsburgh is routinely listed on these, most livable cities lists. And it's not just for the United States, it's for the world, right? And they're recognized as leaders in medical research, healthcare, academia, high tech, robotics. All this has come about, transformation and deindustrialization transformation. And, Pittsburgh's kind of looked at as a new economy success story for the city. But those other Rust Belt cousins have continued to struggle. Detroit continues to struggle to try to reinvent itself, Cleveland and others. And in Tom's mind, he always thought that, what really pulled the city through, when the city needed its heroes the most, he could just look at its football team. It was a football team that was built in its mirror image. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, everybody was associated with a steel mill, right? Not everybody, but darn close to everybody. And, it was blue collar work, bring your lunch pail to work. It was the shower, take a shower after you get home from work, not before you go to work, type of mentality, and that football team was built in that image, right? They had people like Jack Lambert, that were, Mean Joe Green, just these types of people that the city could relate to. And so when they needed their heroes the most, they looked at their football team. And at that time, the Steelers, they came from nowhere, really. In 39 years of existence, they were the best you could describe them as mediocre. And if you wanted to be really on the more fair side, they were horrible for 39 years. Then all of a sudden they weren't. They were pretty good. And then the next year they were Super Bowl winners, and they won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years, the first NFL dynasty of the Super Bowl era. And, Tom had this idea going around in his head for decades. 25 years, Colette. And his family got tired of hearing about it. His friends got tired of hearing about it because Tom's not a writer. I mean, he'd always say this would make a great book, but Tom's a biotech executive, but I'm a writer, and so finally I just kind of like grabbed him and said, Tom, if not now, when? I mean, let's just start the book, and if we should ever veer off of your vision, we'll stop and like course correct. Turned out we never got off of his vision. Working together, we started. A year and a half later, and the book was done, and we were ready to go to market. So it was cool to be able to do it, and I learned so much from the process of collaborating with him and writing the book, and it was awesome going back, particularly to YouTube games and watching these games of my childhood. Right, and I'm 60 years old. I grew up in this era. This is when I fell in love with the NFL and fell in love with the game, and watching those clips on YouTube games, with Kurt Gowdy, Dandy Don Meredith, on the announce team, Howard Cosell, just brought me back to my youth, and it was really cool, and it was great to see these players and be able to respect, this fantastic group of players in the first place, but then coached up to be the best that they could be. And you look at the Pittsburgh Steelers in the '70s; it's just a team loaded with Hall of Famers.
Yeah,
and it's just amazing.
Yeah, it sounds like it was quite the journey. And at that point, it's almost like, what's the worst that could happen? We start writing this book. So you mentioned that, Pittsburgh, obviously, it was known for the steel industry, known for the steel mill, real blue collar. Now that's not really the case, but I think the city still has that reputation. I think probably because of the football team, maybe the name as well. But why do you think that reputation, despite the transformation to, kind of it's almost a yuppie wonderland? I've been there, I think 5-6 years ago. It's beautiful. You don't really think of the steel mills anymore. You see, like you said, academia, biotech, all that stuff. Why do you think that reputation has stuck to the city till now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's just roots and it's foundational, right? The city was, built over, the course of, almost a couple hundred years, and it was always on heavy industry. It was positioned, right in the midst of a ton of natural resources, and also the transportation system with the river. And they started out, with raw materials and quickly moved into iron and then steel. And I think just so much of it is rooted in the community. When you look at every trust that's out there, the humanities and all that, it's all built upon donations from these steel barons that made a ton of money. And then anybody who has multiple generations of Pittsburgh, of Yinzers in their life, they've probably had multi generations of people who earned their living in the steel mills up until they're still like grandpa was a steel worker, and his father before him was a steel worker, and the like. And I think it's just kind of embrace that they understand their history, the history of how the city helped really build America and build other parts of the world, and its role in that. And I think it's a source of pride that none of that stuff was easy. Working in a steel mill was never easy. It wasn't particularly safe. Did it well, and I think it's a source of pride.
Yeah,
it's just like really you can really kind of draw parallels with the Motor City in Detroit. There's not that many people. Well, there's still people making their living off making cars in Detroit, but at the time, the vast majority of people were associated with the motor industry. But there's still that sense of pride in that Detroit community that we are the Motor City, and we built all those great cars.
Yeah, I think pride is the right word there, and it's Pittsburgh pride, like you said. They're not from Pennsylvania, and I found that to be unique, I think, to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia as well. I lived in Philly for a long time, and they never say they're from Pennsylvania. I grew up in California in the Bay Area. People say, "Oh, I'm from Cali." If you're from Houston or Dallas, you say, "I'm from Texas," or wherever. Name any other state. But for some reason, I found that people from Pittsburgh and people from Philly are always like, "No, I'm not. I'm not from Pennsylvania. I'm from Pittsburgh, or I'm from Philly."
It's kind of weird, us Californians, we'll split ourselves up between NorCal and SoCal, and things like that, maybe a little bit. But but you're right. You are either from Philly or you're from Pittsburgh, and I don't even know where you're from. If you're from someplace in between. If you're from Lancaster,
whatever's closest.
Yeah, you probably just choose one and say, I'm close to Pittsburgh. I don't know, but it's strange.
So in your book, and I think in general, people recognized that the Immaculate Reception was the turning point for the Steelers. And it's funny to think about now because they're one of the prestige franchises in the NFL. They have 5 Super Bowl rings. They're one of the best run organizations, not just in the NFL and in sports, but pre-Immaculate Reception. You talked about this a little bit, but they were awful, to be generous, mediocre, to be very generous. What was life like for the Steelers before, the Bradshaw, Franco Harris era, before the Immaculate Reception?
Yeah. Now you said 5 Super Bowl rings. I think they have 6.
Is it 6? Okay.
Yeah. Before things were bleak, man. They were formed like I believe it's 1933. Art Rooney was the owner, and it's still within the Rooney family now. And things were bleak. They were not a successful football team, but they were Pittsburgh's football team. Pittsburgh, they'll still talk about like the dump that Three Rivers Stadium was, but they'll talk about it as like, yeah, but it was our dump. And it's sort of like, if you grew up, if you're looking at your house, like, it wasn't much of a house, but it was so the Steelers weren't very good, but they were at least were embraced by the community. And it was kind of difficult because at the time, when they were being formed, Pittsburgh was like at the, it wasn't where pro football was founded. But that Ohio, Pennsylvania area, before pro football became organized, it was the barnstorming area. Football was very popular. And it was very popular because of the college football game. And the college football game at the time didn't get any better than the University of Pittsburgh and Duquesne. Those were powerhouses, right? Regular contenders for national championships. So football was a thing. College football in particular. They supported the Steelers, but the Steelers weren't very good at all. Then they hired Chuck Noll. That was one thing that certainly benefited. Khaled, for those in your audience who maybe might not be familiar with this, the Steelers have had 3 head coaches it's a span of over 50 years. The Jacksonville Jaguars not that long ago had 3 head coaches in about 16 months. Right. So it's
one of the most ridiculous stats in sports.
Yeah, it's this stability of these coaches. It was Chuck Noll, then it went to Bill Cowher, and now it's Mike Tomlin. So they bring in Chuck Noll, but the things really started to change around with Mean Joe Green. And when I talked about going back to look at games on YouTube, one thing that strikes out right away is number 75. He double teamed. Opposing offenses had to account for Joe Green on every single play. And if you are, we have this kind of, as fans, this recency effect, where we think about like, the best quarterback ever, it's got to be Patrick Mahomes or whatever. And it's just these, these players that are more recent in time. If you're creating a top 10 list of the best players in NFL history and Mean Joe Green is not in that top 10, then you're doing everybody a disservice. You need to go back and maybe readjust your list. He was dominant. The team still struggled. Chuck Noll's first year was 1-13. But then they started bringing people on like Terry Bradshaw. And Terry Bradshaw did not have a great introduction to the NFL. He struggled. And people thought he was too dumb, farm boy from Louisiana, to be a quarterback in the NFL. Remember, back in those days, they called their own plays, right? But coaches began to coach him up. Then they started drafting players like Franco Harris. Franco Harris was a blocking back in college at Penn State for his running mate, Lydell Mitchell, who played many years for the Baltimore Colts. And then, the 1974 draft, 4 Hall of Famers selected in the first 5 rounds. That really changed the course of the franchise.
Probably one of the best drafts of all time, easily.
That draft class, you need in a draft to be able to draft some starting players, but to be able to get 4 guys to end up in the Hall of Fame, that's every April when we have the NFL draft. I'm a Seattle Seahawks fan at this point in time. I'm like, hey, man, if we can get half of that, I'll be pretty happy with it. A quarter of it, that'd be pretty cool too. But yeah.
And then before we jump into the actual Immaculate Reception itself, one of the things you talked about was kind of setting the stage for how different the game was in the 70s versus the era that we're looking at now. What are some of the key differences between the 2 eras?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because it was fascinating. I watch a lot of football. I'm a big football fan, and and of course the game has changed, but there are some big changes in the game. First of all, came about with you look at the quarterback position, and quarterbacks were just another player. You wanted to hit them at the knees, you could hit them at the knees. You could hit them at the head. You could fall on top of them. Today's NFL, you can't do any of that stuff. All those things are roughing the passer penalties. NFL, you were just another player, and you were open to the same degree of punishment as anybody else was. Then you look at the receivers, and receivers were molested at the line of scrimmage. Now we have the illegal contact rule, where defensive backs cannot touch essentially a receiver after 5 yards from the line of scrimmage. When that was first introduced, it was called the Mel Blount rule. It was about number 47 for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who still today remains probably the prototype for a defensive back in the NFL. 6'4", long, rangy, lengthy, had speed, could cover anybody, and would play the run and play it with a bit of an attitude. And, when he came to hit, he brought a full load with him and was looking to make an impact, right? So back before that rule, people like Mel Blount could just push receivers all around, all over the field. There was still pass interference, but the ball had to be in the air. So when you look at today's NFL with a quarterback who's protected by rule and really can't be hit in a lot of different places, there's a lot of talk about throwing a receiver open, or if you are under pressure, knowing where your receivers are and putting it in a spot where your receiver is going to be, so they can at least compete for the ball, make sure it's not intercepted. Not back in the 70s. In the 70s, you could not throw it to a spot because you had no idea what your receiver was. The quarterback had to make eye contact. They had to see the receiver and then be able to throw it. So if you look at passing completion percentages, 50% back in the 70s, you're doing a good job. 50% in today's NFL, you don't see the field, right? You need to be about 62, 63% just to even keep being a starting quarterback. And you really need to be about 2/3 completion. So a lot of that, I think, has changed. And then, today it seems like, offensive coordinators or anybody who calls plays, they fall in love with their playbook, and it's, they've gone to the trouble, Khalid, of making an 11x17 piece of paper, double-sided with 100 plays on it, color-coded and stuff. And it's like, well, geez, if we have 100, 150 plays and we practice all, by golly, I'm going to try to call all of them. Back in the 70s, it was like, you know what, we're going to run this play. It's going to be a rushing attempt. It's going to be, inside, off the left guard. Prove to me you can stop it. And if you can stop it, maybe we'll try something else. And if you can't stop it, there's a good chance that in a play or two, you're going to see that exact same play again, too. And the emphasis was on, controlling the football, since passing completion percentages were about 50%. So running the football, possessing it, working the clock, winning the field position battle, and playing strong defense behind it. I think, most of the teams kind of had that type of approach. That's when things did open up. Eric Coryell and offenses like that. That's when you said, wow, this is a big deal. They still weren't winners, right? It was something new and it's a little bit different. But it wasn't how, defense wins championships type of thing. And then maybe the last thing I'll point out is turnovers. Today's NFL players are just coached to make plays. This episode is being recorded the day after a Monday Night Football game. Very early last night's football game, Fred Warner makes a tackle for the San Francisco 49ers, comes in there, punches the ball up, and causes a fumble. I mean, they're coached up to do that. But back in the day, I would consider Franco Harris to be a fumbler. He would fumble, 6, 7 times a year. 6, 7 times a year, you fumble in today's NFL. Again, you don't see the field, right?
Yeah, you're on the street.
You're kind of given a break, for a fumble or two, unless you're a quarterback. And still, even then, fumbling as a quarterback on pass rush is something different. So, coaching up to take turnovers, but also to eliminate turnovers. There are a lot more turnovers back in the day.
Yeah, it was kind of it was a little more physical, or a lot more physical, a little more violent, maybe a bit simpler of a game, 3 yards in a cloud of dust type of football, the real old school football roots, I think, at that time versus today. It's more spread out.
But I kind of like that. That's one of my frustrations sometimes about football. It's like, you'll see a team and they'll have like success for like 3 running plays, 2 running plays, they get a first down, a 3rd running play, they'll get, some good yardage. And it's like, okay, now we're going to throw. It's like, well, what are you doing, man? You're doing exactly what you want to do. You're reaching the objectives on every single play. And now you're switching it up, perhaps unnecessarily. It depends on what the defense is giving you and all that. But it's one of my frustrations sometimes when you're watching a game from the play calling perspective offensively. It's like, you fall in love with your playbook. But sometimes, just keeping it simple is the best way to do it. And again, last night's game, the 49ers started running the football with a lot of success against the New York Jets, and credit to them. It's like, you know what? Let's just keep running the football. We're doing great. They scored points on 8 consecutive possessions. So job well done. Chalk it up. Let's go on to next week. And sometimes I think we forget that with these offensive geniuses. It's like, let's throw the ball all around and kind of forget about winning.
Yeah, I mean, it shows you there's still room for that physicality and that dominant run game, even in today's NFL, which I think is nice for us old school folks. I think I know I wasn't watching football in the 70s and 80s, but I still have an appreciation for that type of football. And nothing drives me crazier than seeing short yardage runs out of shotgun. And then even in college, I'm seeing teams doing the victory formation out of shotgun or out of the pistol. And I'm just like, what happened?
Yeah, I know.
What happened to the game?
Since when did 3rd and 1 become a passing down, with 4 wideouts, tied in type of deal and a fullback, and let's get that yard. So
I want to talk about the Immaculate Reception itself. Obviously, I think most football fans are aware of generally the situation, the play that happened. Can you kind of set the stage and the context for when the play happened and why it was such a big deal in the moment?
Yeah, the Pittsburgh Steelers' first ever home playoff game, right? And not even televised in the area because of NFL rules at the time and blackouts. But it's a cold day, December 23rd. People gearing up for Christmas. First home playoff game ever. The Oakland Raiders rolling to town. And the Raiders have always been the big, bad Oakland Raiders. Every bit as physical as the Steelers. And at the time, those were probably the most physical teams. And they would be that way forever. I'll throw the Baltimore Ravens in there. But when you look at teams that value, like, let's bring the lunch pail to work and pound on each other for three and a half hours, it's those two teams. And they did it. They pounded on each other. Defensive struggle. We're struggling so much that John Madden replaced his quarterback, brought in Kenny Stabler. Kenny Stabler scores a touchdown with hardly any time left in the game to put this long scramble, 30-plus yard scramble. I want to say 37 yards. And Kenny Stabler's not the most fleet-footed quarterback of them all. But he scores that touchdown, and wow, this game is over. Less than a minute to play. The Steelers do work their way down the field. They have 4th down, about the 40-yard line. The yard line escapes me, but it is 4th down. There's seconds left in the game, and they're really down to a single play. They need to get a first down. And, Terry Bradshaw goes back to pass, gets a heavy pass rush, has to elude the pass rush, and he fires the ball down the center of the field toward Frenchie Few. And that's when things get kind of crazy. That's when Khalid and the rest of Raider Nation talks about the Immaculate Deception. And then the Pittsburgh fans talk about the Immaculate Reception. NFL rules stated at the time that if a forward pass touched an offensive player, another offensive player could not touch it until it was touched by a defender. So if that pass had hit Frenchie Fuqua, it would have then bounced away. It would, at this point in time, either be an incomplete pass or an invalid pass if it was caught by another Pittsburgh Steeler. Well, it was caught by another Pittsburgh Steeler. The ball was thrown, a big collision with Jack Tatum and Frenchie Fuqua. The ball fires backwards in the opposite direction from where it came, about 10 yards. And everybody thinks the game's over at that time. There's Oakland Raider players like, whoo, 4th down, incomplete pass. We'll run out the clock with one kneel down, and the game's over. We advance in the playoffs. Well, the ball flies back toward the line of scrimmage where nobody really sees it, including camera operators. Franco Harris maybe caught the ball. Depends again if you're at Raider Nation or if you're part of the Steeler Nation. If he catches the ball, he catches it off of his shoe tops, and then he starts running. Remember, Oakland Raider players have got their hands in the air celebrating. They're kind of going the other direction anyway. So everyone's going toward the line of scrimmage. Franco's going toward the end zone. Turns around, barely gets into the end zone, but before being pushed out of bounds, he just wiggles his way in. The referees called a touchdown. And then the controversy starts. Did Frenchie Fuqua touch the ball? If so, if Frenchie Fuqua touched that ball, then Franco Harris wouldn't be allowed to catch it. Or did that ball hit Jack Tatum and bounce back? And did Franco Harris, in fact, catch the ball before it hit the ground? All those are still points of contention. There's really no great replays that show it. There's been physicists that have gone through a complete evaluation of what happened in the game and what's possible and what's not possible and what's probable and so on. End of the matter is, even after a long delay, before the age of instant replay, listeners, the referee went to the press box and talked to somebody upstairs. Still, people aren't exactly sure who he spoke to, and then declared that the catch stood. It was a touchdown, and pretty much the game is over. And it is still a thing that causes heartache all through Raider Nation because they call it the Immaculate Reception. It's just a super interesting play. We chose, Tom and I, to use that play as kind of the catalyst of talking about the evolution and the change of the Pittsburgh Steelers from nobodies all of a sudden somebody. Kind of forget the very next week they lost in the playoffs. Some people think, they went on to win the Super Bowl. No, the very next week they lost at home to the Miami Dolphins. That was part of that perfect season, 17-0, only perfect season in NFL history. But a couple years later, 1974, they did win Super Bowl, the first of 4 and 6 years. That was kind of the catalyst, that play from putting the Steelers on the map. Like, they used to be horrible. They were America's lovable losers, and now they're a team to be contended with.
Yeah, I mean, as a Raiders fan, it's tough to be on the wrong side of two plays that maybe with different rules, it's called differently, or maybe with better camera angles or instant replay. It's like the irony of the Immaculate Reception. Maybe it's overturned with instant replay, we're not sure. And then of course the tuck rule is definitely not overturned. If there was no instant replay during the tuck rule, then it would have just been called, as stood. It would have been a fumble, and the Raiders move on. So it's difficult being on both sides.
Two things hard to live with, because you're looking at possibly two additional Super Bowl championships for Raider Nation. And I completely understand it. It's interesting. As we wrote the book, Tom and I both lived in Pleasanton, California, in the Bay Area, and John Madden lived in Pleasanton. In fact, the Madden family owns an awful lot of Pleasanton's commercial business district. We talked to his son. Unfortunately, Coach had passed away and never got a chance to look at the book. But we talked to his son, Mike, and Mike was like, you represent the play fairly in the book. We might not as a catch, but I think we do the play. We talk, I think, in the book, fairly about it, from both sides of the coin. You can look at this a couple of different ways, and people continue to look at it. What's remarkable is that that play happened in 1972, right? Over 50 years later, it's voted by fans as the most memorable play in NFL history. And there's been some amazing plays like David Tyree's helmet catch in the Super Bowl and things like that, which also show up in the top 5. But to have a play that old be considered to be the most memorable play in NFL history by media and by fans alike, I mean, it was something never before seen. The most improbable way for that football game to end, the most improbable way for any football game to end, and it's got a lasting legacy, right?
Yeah, I think you mentioned that a lot of people just assumed that they won the Super Bowl that year, and that's kind of the romantic Disney Channel or Disney movie narrative. It's like, they beat the Raiders on the Immaculate Reception and then go on and win the Super Bowl, and that's maybe why they think it's so memorable. But obviously, they didn't. They won. You talked about the perfect season and the Dolphins beating them, but a few years later, they were able to finally win that Super Bowl. And I think it's just it's interesting that we can lose some of the details when it comes to history and big moments like that, but it was obviously still a turning point. I mean, you go on Pro Football Reference or Wikipedia or whatever, and there's a long list of missed playoff appearances and 1-10, 2-10 type records, and then that is the turning point officially. They finally win. They get their first home playoff game. They finally win that playoff game, and then the next 10 years is pure dominance.
Yeah, a couple years previous, the Steelers are 1-13 in the regular season, right? They really did come from nowhere, and since then they've been a team to reckon with. Mike Tomlin has now been the coach for, probably 20 years if it's not beyond it, and he's never had a losing record. And it's a disappointment when you talk to some Yinzers. It's like, hey, but you've only won one Super Bowl. And Mike Tomlin's got a saying: the standard is the standard. The standard in Pittsburgh is we're playing in the Super Bowl. We're continuing for the Super Bowl, and the playoffs aren't good enough. Where you look at some other teams, like the Cleveland Browns, just give me a playoff game. I would be pretty happy with it, right? The level of expectations around the Steel City remains pretty high, and they can think back to all those great Steelers teams of the '70s for setting that standard.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the research that you were doing with talking folks and watching old games on YouTube. Shout out NFL for making all that available to folks like us that have an interest in the history of the game. What was the most challenging part of the research aspect of it?
Great question. I don't know if I guess the most challenging aspect of it is actually, I will take a step back. It's because the thesis of the book is the Steelers saved Pittsburgh. And you can't really talk about the Steelers saving Pittsburgh without talking about Pittsburgh. And then so it's like, well, okay, let's talk about Pittsburgh. But then you think, well, we can't really talk about Pittsburgh until we talk about like William Penn and the founding of Pennsylvania, right? And so, but I also, we did not want to start off in the 1600s and bore the crap out of the football fan who's interested in 1972, right? But we just couldn't jump into, like 1933 and the Steelers are founded without putting some context. So we had to figure out a way to weave the stories together. So the person who likes the history will be entertained, and the person who likes football, they'll be entertained as well. So I think that was the biggest challenge, is looking at the, researching it. For the football part was easy. It's the city part. Since I didn't grow up in Pittsburgh, for the research that I had to do it was all brand new, and these people were all brand new to me as well. Growing up there, you get a bit of a hint for it when you've got the Carnegie libraries, and you've kind of grown up with that aspect of it. So it was maybe a little bit different for Tom. So for me, I think a challenging aspect was the Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania history, the steel history. And then, there's a perfect storm of factors that caused domestic steel to kind of tumble, right? And that those are political and economic, and doing the research about that to be able to tell a narrative where you didn't need to be a political scientist, or you didn't need to be an economist to understand it, right? So we needed to appeal to the readers. And then with the, when it came down to the storytelling of the Pittsburgh Steelers, it's easy to kind of maybe talk about games, but what we quickly discovered that was the personalities that really made it. Let's talk about Franco Harris. Let's talk about Lynn Swan, Jack Lambert, and these kind of interesting stories. So I that's one of my favorite parts of this book, is that they're just really kind of like 60 campfire stories put into one single book, right? There's short little profiles of these kind of amazing cast of characters. That not only made up the steel industry and made up Pittsburgh, but certainly that made up the Pittsburgh Steelers. Just the owner, Art Rooney. I mean, what a character he was, right? As an infamous horse gambler. In fact, he didn't even consider it gambling. I figured if you did your homework properly, it was like just taking money. And so a big time horse gambler. He's a boxer. He qualified to box in the Olympics. He's a Pittsburgher, man. He's a Yinzer. He's a boxer who bets on horses and decides to found a football team. The quintessential Pittsburgh success story.
And what is it about sports? What is it about this team in particular? I know winning kind of brings everyone together, but what was it about the Steelers era that united the city in such a way? Why were they so special?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question, Colette. And I think it's, I think it goes back to, what we talked about a little bit before, is that the team seemed to be built in the mirror image of a blue collar city. There's a relatability there. It's like, these Billy White Shoes Johnson, he played for the Houston Oilers. John Stallworth, he played for the Steelers. Right. So I think a lot of that was just, the way that the team approached the game of football, and the people that were on it, they were relatable to the city. And it's like, that if that guy could do my job in the steel mill. In fact, he would like to do the steel mill work if he wasn't a football player. And I think they could kind of, see that, and it became, relatable and a source of pride. People looked at it, and again, there's part of that Pittsburgh, us against the world type of mentality, that it's, this is our team, this is our stadium, this is, this is our stadium, but it's our stadium.
I know what that's like as a Raiders fan and a former A's fan. But going to the Oakland Coliseum, opposing fans would dump on it and say, no, that's our dump. You guys can't talk about it like that. We can say whatever we want, but you're not allowed to talk about it.
I love the Coliseum. I've seen Oakland A's games sitting in the front row for $34. I want to, I always just tell people, be careful what you wish for. Try to sit in the front row at Yankee Stadium for anything less than $1,000, right?
Right. Were there any stories that were kind of left on the shop room floor that you had to cut out of the book that you wish you were able to include?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Not about the Steelers, but when we first turned in our manuscript, it was 133,000 words, and our publisher was like, "Oh no," today's reader, they kind of like 65,000 words, 80,000 words. It's like, but there's too much stories to tell. There's a Steelers story and a Pittsburgh story. Our book, I don't think is that big. It's I don't know, it's 346 pages long. And I actually held up a book. It was War and Peace. That was on my desk. And I was like, this is over 1,000 pages. And my publisher goes, nobody buys War and Peace anymore, and nobody reads it. Today we like smaller books. I'm like, so how do we cut it down? We were able to cut it down to 130,000 words. So we did cut like 3,000 words out. But there are, stories like Iron City beer. Iron City beer is synonymous. It's Pittsburgh, and so we had a little, profile about Iron City beer and so forth. Little stories like that didn't make it. We wanted to talk more about Roberto Clemente. You talk about why the Steelers are so ingrained in the city of Pittsburgh. They're more ingrained than the Pittsburgh Pirates, and more ingrained within the city than the Pittsburgh Penguins hockey team as well. But there are still some, folklore heroes, and Roberto Clemente is one of them, and what he meant to that city, particularly through his charitable giving and the like. So there were some ancillary stories, that our editor, finally said, hey, this, while it has to do with Pittsburgh, it doesn't really apply to the Steelers. So why don't we hit the cutting room floor with it? And the whole bit of Pittsburgh languages. There's a lot of people that think that their own dialect of English is spoken in Pittsburgh, and in a way it is. My favorite is the word G, and I think if I had to spell it, it'd be Jeet. When I first heard it, I'm like, what's this got to do with like a Jeep? And then you just start kind of breaking it down a little bit, and it's because they speak so fast. It's really short for "Did you eat?" G. But it's just one of these many different words that Yinzer will come up with, where you're like, well, what are you talking about? So there's some things like that we would have loved to include in the book, but I'm a writer, not a publisher. I was told to get rid of them.
Yeah, you got to let the editors do their job. What's been the reaction to the book since it's been published? Since obviously you have so many famous folks in there, so many cultural heroes in the city of Pittsburgh, and you're talking about, real events, and a lot of these folks thankfully are still around to react to them. So what's been the reaction from some of the people in the book, and then of course from the fans?
It's been very well received. I never got a chance to meet Franco Harris, but Franco had a chance to meet our book. And one of the things that we cherish is a photo of him holding our book. And we know we are, Tom and I have, since the publication of the book, connected with Dana Harris, his widow. And, she's a big supporter of the book, and said, Franco, she read chapters to him. And he had reviewed, quite a bit of the book before his death, which was the day it was published. It's the day he passed away. And so, that hearing that was fantastic. And having Dana Harris's support of our book has been wonderful. It's been well received. It's highly rated for that. We're thankful. So we appreciate the ratings, and I think most people like it. I mean, let me ask you, Khalid. You're a Raiders fan. You're not even a Pittsburgh fan. Did you like the book or not?
Yeah, I thought I made that obvious in my questions and stuff. But I'm such a a history junkie, a sports history junkie, a football junkie. I mean, I love a lot of sports, but football is, 1 through 5 on my top 10. So reading about this and just the level of detail that you go in. I mean, you mentioned talking about William Penn, and you guys go even before that. You talk about the native tribes that live there, and you really set the stage, which I appreciated. But I love these stories. These guys are just like these guys from the 70s, Kenny Stabler and Franco Harris and Terry Bradshaw, all these names, just an endless list of Hall of Famers. They're like mythical figures to me. And, growing up as a 90s kid, I had a Sports Illustrated subscription, and just reading, the older stories about them, watching ESPN Classic. So it really took me back to that time. I mean, it was a little painful, obviously, because I'm a Raiders fan. And I wish it worked out differently, but I wasn't alive to witness it. So maybe it stung a little bit lighter than the Tuck Rule did. But I really loved it, and I could feel the passion that both of you had for this book and for this story. So, I mean, thank you for telling it. And thank you for publishing it.
And I appreciate you saying that. If I can get a diehard Raider fan, to say, yeah, I like the book, kind of reluctantly, those damn Steelers, because I know the feeling. I'm actually getting a little goosebumps feeling this right now. But like watching my Cowboy at the time, I love those Cowboys, and watching the Super Bowls on YouTube, and like here comes Jackie Smith's going to drop that touchdown pass. Yeah, sure enough, he drops it again. And just the Hall of Fame tight end. If some of you listeners aren't familiar with him, Jackie Smith played forever for the St. Louis Cardinals, joined the Dallas Cowboys at the end of his very last year. He dropped a wide open touchdown pass in the end zone. And that was the difference in a 4-point Super Bowl game, 35-31. It's a shame that that's what he's remembered for as a Hall of Famer. But watching that, just, it happened again. You can, go, here comes a made field goal.
You get that same feeling in your stomach, right?
And I just did say field goal. I did want to also throw in kicking, and the difference between the 70s and the 2020. Now you'll go, guys are like routinely hitting 50-yard field goals. I mean, if you don't make at least half your 50-yard field goals, you don't have a job very longer. Mm-hmm. Back in the day, people were making, they were struggling with 30-yard field goals. It wasn't that uncommon to miss a 30-yard field goal. You look at, the Steelers had Roy Gerella. He's featured all through the book because of the big kicks that he made. His statistics would not allow him to play in the NFL today. Just not nearly as accurate as you need to be. It's really fascinating. If you like football, definitely go back to YouTube and check these out. For me, it was reliving my youth. Like, I remember that game. And when you hear people like Howard Cosell on the microphone, it just brings me back to being a kid sitting in front of the TV and watching the game that you had to watch. Because back in the day, you couldn't watch every game or whatever. You watched what was on the network. And there weren't a lot of networks. 3 of them. No one's counting the 4th one, PBS. But a whole different era. But to answer your question, the book's been well received, and we're grateful for that. Because it's certainly it was a lot of work, and it's a passion project for Tom. Right. And Tom, it's, I just to tell you a little about this is a fundraising book as well. When I grabbed Tom and held him by the shoulders and said, "Hey, Tom, if not now, when?" There's a story behind that. And that is in March of 2019, I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. It's for those who are not familiar with it, it's an incurable blood cancer. In fact, it is the topic of my second book, which is called Me, Myself, and My Multiple Myeloma. It changed my outlook a little bit on life, right? Being diagnosed with cancer. And one of the things that, I did for years was look at a timeline exercise where horizontal line, your birth, your death, where do you think you are? And so when I was diagnosed, I kind of revisited that and go, I'm probably further to the right than I thought it was before my diagnosis, right? And as a musician, I'm always looking for some kind of cool saying to put on the back of a shirt to make more money at gigs. Right. And one of those sayings came up in my head, if not now, when? So looking at that timeline, what are the things you want to do? Who are the people you want to do it with? Let's do the most important things in your life. So that was the impetus between that, if not now, when? Well, Tom took that and thought, you know what? Now let's do this book. But Tom very much being a proud Yinzer, he wanted a book that would be supported, by the community, for the community. And so he came to me, soon after we started and said, I got an idea. What if we donate all of our net writers proceeds to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, Hillman Cancer Center, and
Wow,
for you. And I'm like, well, yeah, that sounds great, right? So it was cool. Last year, we donated $4,032 to the Hillman Cancer Center at UPMC. That 32 was very purposeful in the end. Franco Harris is on the cover of our book, and with all the support that we've had with Franco, and we even got some cool little hats, that have Franco catching the ball and a hashtag and be like Franco, which is a thing over in the Pittsburgh community. So I did want to bring that part up. It's truly a passion project for Tom in particular, and a book that gives back to his community.
And like I said, I could really feel that passion when reading the book. And what I love about books like this is it's like a little form of time travel. You get to step into a different era or multiple different eras and hear stories and direct quotes and all that. So where can folks find your book?
You can purchase Immaculate: How the Steelers Saved Pittsburgh wherever fine books are sold. So it's a if you want to go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your mom and pop store, wherever. You can also get it at my website, which is my name, rayhartjen.com. We'll be happy to sign it for you if you just tell us who to sign it to. You can also get it at the book's website, which is Steelers Saved Pittsburgh. .com. But anywhere you want to buy books from, you can get Immaculate.
Yeah, I wish I did that. I bought a digital copy through the Apple bookstore, so I wish I bought the physical copy.
And
had you sign it as well.
Somebody. I'll be able to get it to you. So
I appreciate it.
So we'll talk. I'll send you one.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you again for writing this book, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I'll talk to you anytime about football, my friend. Since it's 1 through 5 of your top 10 list, we'll talk football.
Sounds good.